The Russia-Iran Mi-28 helicopter deal must be understood not as a simple military transaction, but as a calculated political maneuver that signals a broader shift in global power dynamics. When Russia supplies advanced attack helicopters to Iran, it is making a statement far beyond the battlefield. It is declaring that the international order, dominated for decades by Western influence, is being actively contested. This transfer represents a strategic alignment between two nations that share a common interest in resisting US pressure, sanctions, and geopolitical containment. The weapon itself becomes a symbol of defiance, a visible reminder that alliances are hardening and rival power centers are strengthening their coordination. Such arms deals are designed to alter perceptions as much as they alter military capabilities. The message is not only directed toward the United States, but also toward regional players in the Middle East. It tells neighboring countries that Iran's defensive posture is evolving and that Russia is willing to back its partners with tangible military support. This has a psychological impact that can be just as powerful as the physical weapon system itself. Governments respond to these signals by recalculating their own security strategies, increasing military spending, and seeking new alliances, which further intensifies competition and distrust across the region. At the same time, this move reflects Russia's broader ambition to expand its geopolitical footprint. By strengthening ties with Iran, Russia secures influence in a strategically vital region that connects Europe, Asia, and global energy routes. It gains leverage in diplomatic negotiations and positions itself as a counterweight to Western power. This is not charity or ideological solidarity. It is a pursuit of national interest framed as cooperation. Military assistance becomes a tool of diplomacy, a way to buy loyalty, influence outcomes, and shape regional balances of power. For Iran, accepting such military support is also a political calculation. Under heavy sanctions and international pressure, Iran seeks alternative partnerships to reduce its isolation. By aligning more closely with Russia, it signals that it is not alone and that it has powerful allies willing to challenge US-led pressure campaigns. This strengthens Iran's bargaining position on the global stage and allows it to project resilience even in the face of economic hardship. The helicopter deal thus becomes part of a larger strategy of survival, resistance, and regional positioning. What makes this situation especially significant is how it reflects the growing fragmentation of the global system. Instead of a cooperative international order, we are witnessing the formation of competing blocs, each armed, defensive, and increasingly suspicious of the other. These blocs are not built on shared humanitarian goals, but on strategic interests, military capabilities, and power calculations. As more countries choose sides, the world moves further away from multilateral cooperation and closer to a new era of geopolitical confrontation. This dynamic creates a dangerous environment where every arms transfer is interpreted as a provocation, and every defensive move is seen as an offensive threat by the opposing side. The Russia-Iran helicopter deal fits directly into this pattern, reinforcing the logic of rivalry rather than dialogue. Instead of reducing tensions, such actions raise the stakes, making diplomacy more difficult and military solutions more attractive to policymakers who view strength through the lens of force rather than cooperation. The global military industry thrives on conflict, uncertainty, and fear, and the Russia Iran helicopter deal is a clear example of how rising tensions are transformed into profitable opportunities. Whenever headlines warn of possible war or regional instability, defense corporations see expanding markets. Governments respond by increasing military budgets, justifying massive spending in the name of national security. Behind the language of protection and deterrence lies a powerful economic engine that depends on continuous demand for weapons, spare parts, training systems, and long term maintenance contracts. War preparation becomes a business model, and global insecurity becomes a steady source of revenue. This system creates a troubling incentive structure. Instead of encouraging peace and diplomatic solutions, it rewards escalation and militarization. The more unstable the world becomes, the more contracts are signed and the more profits are generated. Political leaders often maintain close relationships with defense contractors, lobbyists, and corporate executives who benefit directly from expanded military spending. These connections influence policy decisions, shaping foreign strategies that prioritize hardware over humanitarian needs. As a result, public funds that could be invested in education, healthcare, housing, and infrastructure are redirected toward weapons programs that do little to improve the everyday lives of citizens. Ordinary people bear the economic consequences of this system. Higher defense budgets often mean higher taxes, increased government debt, and reduced social services. Inflation can rise as resources are diverted from productive sectors into military production. In developing regions, this effect is even more severe, where limited public funds are stretched thin while governments feel pressured to keep up with regional arms races. The promise of security becomes an illusion because true stability cannot be built on weapons alone. Instead of strengthening communities, excessive militarization weakens social foundations and deepens inequality. The international arms market also reinforces global power imbalances. Wealthy nations and major exporters dominate the industry, while smaller or sanctioned countries become dependent buyers. This dependency creates leverage, allowing powerful states to influence political decisions and foreign policies through military supply chains. Arms transfers are rarely neutral transactions. They come with expectations, strategic alignments, and political conditions. The result is a global system where military strength is traded like a commodity, shaping alliances and rivalries based on economic interests rather than collective security. What makes this situation even more dangerous is how normalized it has become. Public discourse often treats military expansion as inevitable, as if there is no alternative to constant preparation for war. Media narratives frequently focus on technological advancements in weapons rather than questioning why such investments are prioritized in the first place. Over time, societies become accustomed to the idea that peace is fragile and war readiness is permanent. This mindset benefits the arms industry while narrowing the space for serious discussions about disarmament, cooperation, and conflict prevention, allowing the cycle of profit driven militarization to continue expanding across regions and political systems. Militarization creates a self reinforcing cycle of fear that pushes nations into continuous escalation, even when no side truly desires open conflict. When one country increases its military capabilities, neighboring states and rival powers interpret that move as a direct threat. In response, they expand their own defense programs, purchase more advanced weapons, and strengthen military alliances. What begins as a claim of self defense quickly transforms into an arms race, where every action is mirrored by a counteraction. This dynamic does not produce security, it produces suspicion, anxiety, and a permanent state of readiness for confrontation. The psychological dimension of this cycle is just as important as the physical buildup of weapons. Political leaders often rely on fear based narratives to justify military spending and aggressive policies. Citizens are told that danger is always near, that enemies are constantly preparing to strike, and that survival depends on greater military strength. Over time, these messages shape public perception, making people more willing to accept massive defense budgets and reduce social investment. Fear becomes a political tool used to rally support, silence dissent, and normalize policies that would otherwise face strong opposition. This escalation pattern also weakens diplomatic channels. When countries prioritize military power over negotiation, trust erodes and communication breaks down. Diplomatic efforts are viewed with suspicion, interpreted as weakness or strategic deception. As a result, even minor disputes can spiral into major confrontations because there is no strong foundation of cooperation to manage crises. The presence of advanced weapons systems raises the stakes of every conflict, making miscalculations more dangerous and reducing the margin for error. A single incident, misunderstanding, or technical failure can trigger a chain reaction with severe regional or global consequences. The economic cost of this cycle is enormous. Resources that could be used to address poverty, climate change, healthcare, and education are redirected toward military expansion. Governments justify this spending by arguing that national survival is at risk. But in reality, many of the most serious threats to human security are not military in nature. Hunger, disease, environmental disasters, and economic instability cannot be defeated with missiles or helicopters. Yet the militarization mindset continues to dominate policy decisions, reinforcing the idea that force is the primary solution to complex global problems. This cycle of fear also affects global relationships. Instead of building partnerships based on shared development goals and mutual benefit, countries increasingly define themselves through opposition to perceived enemies. International cooperation becomes more difficult as trust declines and strategic competition intensifies. The world becomes divided into rival camps, each preparing for conflict rather than working toward collective security. As militarization spreads, the space for peace oriented policies shrinks, leaving societies trapped in a pattern where fear drives decisions, escalation becomes routine, and genuine stability remains out of reach. The stability of the Middle East stands at a critical crossroads, and any major confrontation involving the United States, Iran, and Russia would carry consequences far beyond the region's borders. This is not simply a localized power struggle, it is a global risk scenario with economic, political, and humanitarian dimensions. The Middle East sits at the heart of international energy routes, trade corridors, and strategic waterways. Even a limited military escalation could disrupt oil and gas supplies, drive up global energy prices, and create economic shockwaves that would be felt by households and businesses around the world. What happens in this region rarely stays confined to it. The involvement of major global powers makes the situation even more volatile. When rival superpowers engage indirectly through regional allies or military support, conflicts tend to become prolonged and more complex. Proxy dynamics increase the scale of destruction while reducing accountability. Instead of swift resolutions, wars become drawn out struggles where local populations suffer the most. Infrastructure is damaged, public services collapse, and millions of people face displacement. These humanitarian consequences do not end at national borders. Refugee flows increase pressure on neighboring countries and strain international aid systems. Political instability in the Middle East also has long term implications for governance and social cohesion. Prolonged conflict weakens state institutions and creates power vacuums that extremist groups can exploit. When security deteriorates, communities become more fragmented and trust between different social and religious groups erodes. This environment makes reconciliation and rebuilding far more difficult, trapping societies in cycles of violence and recovery that repeat over generations. External military involvement often intensifies these divisions by favoring certain groups over others, further complicating internal political dynamics. Global trade networks are also vulnerable to regional conflict. Major shipping routes pass through Middle Eastern waters, and any disruption can affect the flow of goods between Asia, Europe, and Africa. Rising insurance costs, rerouted shipments, and port closures can increase the price of everyday products worldwide. These economic effects disproportionately impact low income populations who already struggle with rising living costs. Once again, the burden of geopolitical rivalry falls on ordinary people who have no influence over the decisions made by powerful political and military leaders. Perhaps most concerning is the long term normalization of instability. When conflict becomes a regular feature of regional politics, the international community begins to treat it as inevitable. Instead of investing in long term peace building and regional cooperation, attention shifts to crisis management and damage control. This reactive approach prevents meaningful progress towards stability and reinforces the idea that the Middle East is destined for perpetual conflict. In reality, sustainable peace requires diplomatic engagement, economic development, and inclusive political solutions that address the root causes of tension rather than relying on military dominance and temporary power balances. The world today stands before a fundamental choice: continue down the path of war driven politics or move toward policies centered on peace, cooperation, and human well being. This is not an abstract moral debate. It is a practical decision that shapes budgets, alliances, and the daily lives of billions of people. When governments prioritize military expansion, they send a clear message about their values. They communicate that power is measured in weapons and influence rather than in social stability, economic fairness, and the quality of life of their citizens. This approach creates a global environment where confrontation becomes normal and diplomacy becomes secondary. Choosing peace oriented policies does not mean ignoring security concerns. It means redefining what security truly means. Real security is not built solely on military strength, but on strong institutions, economic opportunity, public health, and social trust. When people have access to education, employment, and basic services, societies become more resilient to conflict and extremism. Investments in human development reduce the conditions that often lead to violence and instability. Yet these investments are frequently overshadowed by massive defense budgets that absorb public resources without addressing the deeper causes of insecurity. Another critical aspect of this choice is accountability. War politics often operate behind closed doors where decisions are made with limited public oversight. Citizens are told that national security requires secrecy, even when those policies involve enormous financial commitments and long term consequences. Peace oriented governance, by contrast, depends on transparency and democratic participation. It encourages public debate about foreign policy priorities and demands that leaders justify their decisions not only in terms of strategic advantage, but also in terms of social impact and ethical responsibility. International cooperation is also central to this shift. Global challenges such as climate change, pandemics, economic inequality, and migration cannot be solved through military competition. They require shared strategies, resource coordination, and mutual trust. When countries focus on rivalry and power projection, these collective problems are neglected. A peace centered approach would prioritize multilateral institutions and regional partnerships that aim to reduce tensions, manage disputes peacefully, and promote long term stability through cooperation rather than coercion. Perhaps the most important element of this choice lies in public awareness. Societies often accept militarization because it is presented as unavoidable. Political narratives frame war preparation as realism and peace advocacy as weakness. Changing this mindset requires critical thinking, independent media, and active civic engagement. When people question where their tax money is going, whose interests are being served, and what alternatives exist, they begin to challenge the dominance of war centered policies. This shift in public consciousness can pressure leaders to reconsider their priorities and invest in strategies that value human life, dignity, and sustainable development over short term power gains and military dominance